to. Yes, of course, I saw already. Yes. And thank you very much. And we are going to our next presenter from Carter School for Conflict and Peace and Conflict Resolution, George Mason University, Professor Dr. Richard Rubenstein, with the topic of sources of new tribalism. Can human solidarity overcome structural violence? Please, dear Professor, we are with you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me, and the rest and my colleagues also at the Carter School. We're very happy to be here and have the chance to talk with you. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank my colleague Karina for talking directly about Ukraine, which is something I'm not expert in and I'm not going to do very much in this talk. I want to suggest some developments in the field of conflict theory and also practice that I think you may find applicable to reconciliation in Ukraine. But my main work lately on these problems has been actually directed towards conflict in the United States. So I think it may be interesting for you to see what some of the commonalities are. Let me say that there is now considerable discussion about what some people are calling the new tribalism or neo-tribalism. This reflects a breakdown of the distinction between political conflicts, which we traditionally have been thinking of as interest-based conflicts or sometimes ideological conflicts, and ethnic or racial or religious or nationalist conflicts, which are traditionally conceived of as culture-based or values-based. One might say even that a major movement of our time in the United States as well as in Ukraine and elsewhere is toward the tribalization of political conflict, which is a problem. Since tribal conflicts do not lend themselves to traditional interest-based forms of conflict resolution or reconciliation, they tend to become intractable, and they tend to become particularly intractable where there's an overlap between ethno-cultural factors in conflict and interests, including class interests, which I want to say something about in a moment. This development, what I'm calling neo-tribalist development, was not entirely unforeseen. Two sources that predicted this sort of thing were peace theorists on the left, politically, in particular Johann Galtung and John Burton, and Herb Kelman and some others, who emphasized the shift from interest-based conflict to needs-based conflict and tried to develop methods, workshops, and other methods of dealing with parties that were acting in conflictual ways because of unsatisfied basic needs, which could also be interpreted as cultural. I don't mean basic needs simply in the sense of survival, needs of 350 calories a day. I'm talking about identity and recognition and human development. At the same time, from the right, we had predictions being made by scholars like Samuel P. Huntington, who wrote a famous book called The Clash of Civilizations. In fact, he wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine in 1993, which I responded to in 1994, pointing out in that article that while Burton and Galtung had departed from power-based realist concepts of conflict in order to emphasize needs, Huntington, in theorizing that the coming wave of conflicts would be culture-based, would be civilizational, maintained a realist perspective on power, and basically substituted civilization for nation states, and came up with basically a variation on realist theory. But I think probably the most profound early study of neo-tribalism was that undertaken by the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School many years earlier. In their attempt to explain the tribalization of European politics, especially in Germany. To them, the key to explaining this development was the repression of class consciousness, repression literally in the Freudian sense, which opened the door to a substitution of the folk state for the working class. To understand this development, the critical theorists maintained, one would have to broaden one's understanding of citizens and workers to include not only their socioeconomic position and function, but also their psychological formation in the family and larger identity groups, in the small family, and if you like, in the big family, which was how national communities were being characterized. So a key to recent developments, I think, in thinking about this, is the turn in peace studies and conflict studies towards structural analysis. So I want to say a little bit about this, what some people are calling the structural turn in conflict resolution, and then invite you to think about how that might be applied to the Ukraine situation. Galtung, as you probably know, discussed the regular production of conflict under the heading of structural violence, pointing out that societies organized hierarchically and featuring nested institutional structures were systematically denying the fulfillment of basic human needs in such a way as to make conflict very likely, if not inevitable. In a book that I wrote a couple of years ago called Resolving Structural Conflict, I tried to push this a bit further, but still pointing out that we're understanding better now than we used to, that conflicts that we've formally described as the result of kind of unfortunate subjective conditions, people's misunderstandings, prejudices, and so forth, or as the result of pure power struggles, now seem more and more to be the normal products of the operation of certain systems. So that, to take the most obvious example, a structured system like a prison is a machine for conflict. It makes conflict inevitable. It rests on the systematic deprivation of basic human needs, and there's no way prisons are not going to be violent. It's almost by definition the nature of prison. In my book, I wrote that violence is as normal a product of the prison as the license plates and other products that are produced by a prison population. So what does this have to do with neo-tribalism? Well, there's a tendency still to see conflicts involving large social systems, hegemonic social systems, for example, socioeconomic systems. There's a tendency to see those conflicts and those issues as being quite opposed to conflicts produced by conflicts involving cultural organizations, hatreds, alienation, and so on. For example, when Donald Trump won the presidential election of 2016 in the US, several social scientists produced studies claiming to show that the pro-Trump and anti-Clinton vote, especially in key so-called battleground states of the Midwest in the United States, was fundamentally the result of cultural alienation, racial prejudice, misogyny, religious fanaticism, or what might be called generally ultra-conservatism, or nationalist conservatism, if you want to put it like that. And this was offered as this was put in an either-or way. This is what the conflict was about. It was not about economics. Well, it never made any sense. That analysis never made any sense to me. In the first place, it's absolutely clear, of course, in America, they don't like to talk about class, so they categorize people in ways. They talk about voters without college degrees, for example, which is right? That's a euphemism for working class, because they don't want to say working class. And what had clearly happened in key industrial states, like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, which were traditionally Democratic states in which the voters had voted twice for Barack Obama. They abandoned the Democrats, they abandoned Clinton, and they voted for Trump, and that's why Trump won the vote in the Electoral College. Those were the key change. And those are, in this year's elections, those again are the battleground states. Well, these are states where there's a decisive working class vote, both in racial terms, both black and white. If you look at those states also, you find, and Trump understood this very well, you find that these are the same areas in which there has been deindustrialization, in which working people have entered a state that Europeans now call precarity, in which basically they are one layoff or one medical emergency or one family crisis away from poverty. Understanding the degree of economic insecurity being felt by workers, who, by the way, now no longer had strong unions to represent them, trade unions, because of the profound weakness of the trade union movement. Trump exploited this to the hilt by offering not only a cultural nationalist-leaning program, but even more in the election campaign itself, an economic nationalist program. He offered to create jobs. He offered to get tough with China. He offered to stop immigrants who were portrayed as taking jobs from workers and so forth. So this was not a question of either cultural nationalism or working class discontent, but clearly it was both. And the working class discontent, this is, I think, important to point out, and I have a feeling it's also true in Ukraine and many other countries as well, is not simply based on economic insecurity, but also cultural, deep, intense cultural insecurity. In the US, for example, income and wealth equality has grown at a rate unequaled by any other advanced industrial state. But if you look, that sounds very economic, that sounds economistic. But if you look at the communities that are key communities in the elections, for example, you find that family and community life have markedly deteriorated and visibly deteriorated. We're talking about areas in which There are divorce rates exceeding 50% of all marriages contracted, in which rates of drug addiction, alcoholism, and mental illness are soaring, in which community institutions, in particular the schools, are especially failing to fulfill the promise of making a better life for the next generation. And in which even in a sort of common sense way, you go visit these communities and you find out what people are complaining about is children won't obey their parents. Parents won't listen to the children. In this pandemic, the one business I know that's thriving is the family therapy business. So under those kinds of circumstances, it's not surprising that conservative, church-going people, whether working class or not, or petty bourgeois, whatever their class, would consider the liberal thinking and what they might call licentious behavior of members of another tribe, the progressive tribe, to be not only offensive, but dangerous to their own community. And of course, the progressives don't like to think of themselves as members of a tribe at all. They reserve that they reserve that epithet for right-wing tribalists. But of course, the left-wingers also constitute a tribe. And both tribes, shall I say, have now clearly the tendency to blame the other one to try to see the other one as the source of the insecurity, right? So why are they doing that? Well, let me suggest, because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, let me suggest quickly that that these conflicts, neo-tribal conflicts, it seems to me, are symptomatic responses to failing systems, to systems in crisis, hegemonic systems in crisis. And those systems are both socioeconomic and political and cultural. Two requirements exist for this conflict to be escalated, it seems to me. One is, I've just mentioned, that there's visible deterioration of communal institutions accompanied by intense feelings of insecurity. Two, there's a taboo which prevents analysis of the system and recognition of the system as the source of those problems. This is the point, it seems to me, at which we are forced to and ought to delve into the psychology of the situation, and in which your discussions of psychosynthesis and all are absolutely relevant. Because among the ways systems defend themselves is to make certain kinds of discussions of themselves, the system itself, taboo. The critical theorists in Frankfurt had, and later in the United States, had one way of approaching this. I mean, they talked about, in particular with Germany in mind, they talked about the taboo against criticizing the father and the fatherland. They talked about the authoritarian family and so forth. Some of that learning, it seems to me, is probably still applicable. But I have to say that I think we're really just at the beginning of understanding how that taboo is, how these taboos are generated, what their sources are, and what to do about it. One thing I do believe, I guess to make this clear, I have colleagues who I'm very proud of, who are now engaged in research and of a kind of dialogic research with members of, in one case, hate groups, what are known as hate groups, extreme right-wing groups who could easily simply be themselves stereotyped and attacked and called all sorts of names. But what my colleague Sarah Cobb, who's one of these people, Karina knows her very well, wants to find out is what's driving this. What's driving this? And one of the things that she is finding out is that there's such a strong impulse to try to correct what's gone wrong locally by adhering to the local traditions, by trying to regain some pride in one's own cultural heritage, by trying to re-energize institutions like the church, that the people involved in these discussions have basically forbidden themselves from thinking about or seeing that it's that very conservative Christian culture, in many cases, that they prize so highly, is actually part of the problem. That their attitudes of self-reliance and inability to trust governments is part of the problem. That their individualism, which kind of prevents them even from talking about themselves as a community, for example, a socioeconomic community, but kind of keeps forcing them to characterize themselves in traditionalist ways is a major problem. And to conclude, if you say, well, what's the answer to this? I think at this point we have to say, that some of the kinds of dialogue, educational activities, and everything that people like Karina are talking about are probably going to be useful and maybe actually essential. But that appealing to an ideal like global humanism as the answer, recognizing our common humanity and so forth, will overcome this problem. Well, it won't, because globalism is an article of faith of one of the tribes involved in the conflict. It's an article of faith of the progressive tribe. So that doesn't help. The kind of dialogue that we're talking about, it seems to me, must be one that opens up the possibility of opens up the question, which systems are generating the conflict? How are they generating the conflict? And how can those systems be changed? How can the systems be changed without necessarily posing a greater cultural threat than that which has already been posed? In our field, conflict resolution, we still are so used to thinking in terms of calling out the mediator to solve the problem. I'm sort of neutral third party activity. That we haven't really let us ourselves think very much about questions like, if you want to change a system, when is a reform a band-aid and when is a reform a step towards a nonviolent revolution? We haven't let ourselves really talk the language and think the language of system change very much, in part because it's political. It's not political in a narrow partisan sense. I think the idea that we have to recognize that neo-tribalism is affecting everybody, including left as well as right. But the idea that it the idea that the question before us is how to change a system nonviolently and effectively involves politics on a different level. And especially, I think, it involves a refusal to be kind of trapped in the political systems which claim to be change permitting or change promoting, but which actually are system maintaining. That is to say, it kind of, so we're in some ways looking at our students, looking at the younger generation who are experimenting with different political forms for clues about the kind of activities that might help us change a system that's generating conflict. In the case of Ukraine, one of course would have to look at the imperial system, which is in many ways responsible for trapping for making Ukraine a political football. But one would also want to open the door to people to ask the question that almost never gets asked, even in conflict resolution forums, which is, what kind of society do you really want to live in? And that includes, what kind of socioeconomic system do you want? What kind of relationship between church and state do you want? Which type of democracy suits you, instead of just saying democracy, democracy? How direct a form of democracy do you want to, how participatory do you want your form of democracy to be? These are the questions not being asked in Syria, not being asked in Libya, not being asked in Congo or any place else I know, by people who are in the peace business. Maybe because it would offend so many powers that be if the answers turned out to be awkward. I don't know, but I do know that neo-tribalism is a problem, I think, for all of us, and one that demands kinds of imaginative responses that we're not always willing to provide. Oh, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Rubenstein. I'm just impressed, deeply impressed from your speech and from the things that are touching to the core of things. Maybe it's sometimes just hard to see the core, because the core is something that's more strong than the things that we are. So thank you very much for the synth and for touching those core. I think it's brings some maybe philosophical questions and fundamental questions about perception. First, Joseph, can you tell me, please, if someone have questions to Professor Rubenstein?
Can I make a quick comment? It's always amazing. I'm so glad that you can speak here. You're such a deep thinker and bring us. And I think for Ukraine specifically, while I was speaking, I was thinking, and there are a lot of people who live in Ukraine right now. I would love to hear from them. But what I see, the first thing which really was screaming at me is this very important understanding that Ukraine is not single country existing in vacuum which has to reconcile. We really have to understand that it's part of bigger system, exactly. And there is a huge Russian influence through media, through power, through multiple other sources. And it's really interesting for me always that while Russia is actually pretty multicultural and have pretty good multicultural policies in itself, it's really imposing on Ukraine. This is very clear Russian idea, which mirrored in Ukraine was also very nationalistic idea. And it's really changing, as you clearly pointed, the systems, the systemic pressure really changing completely discussion or discourse in Ukraine. And this is very important. And if we also speak about this still very strong problem between Russia and European Union and United States, Ukraine in the midst of all of this, and it's structurally really influenced the whole process of reconciliation. Just a small note.
Thank you, Karina.
If no one, I want to ask a question, Professor, about, you touched the core of, I think it was probably more about not just democracy, but identification of personality. I think the question is, so I want just to hear, to ask about your perception of libertarianism, because I was a little bit associating your ideas to the question that I'm a little bit here from, for instance, Ayn Rand perception, maybe the perception of core, or I don't know, maybe if the society can take the responsibility for such question, if the society can produce such conflict, maybe the individualism as libertarianism, as American, and the libertarianism that comes from the United States, maybe this is the more gives the answer. I'm just asking the question. It's open question. If you can.
Yeah, it's you know, I think in a way we find ourselves in the position of having to develop a new language almost to, you know, to discuss this, to describe it. I've noticed, for example, that in the first place, when you talk about the American tribes, you're talking about different kinds of individualism, but still very powerful individualistic motives. This is not that really very responsive to your question, but one of the things that's happening here, which is fascinating, is that the pandemic, that these I'm not happy, and I'm sure lots of anthropologists and others are also not happy with the way we describe cultures, especially when we try to do it kind of shorthand, low context, high context, you know, that sort of thing, which really I think is mostly nonsense. But if you talk about individualism and collectivism as a possible pole, as possible poles, understanding that that's not the same as a left-right division at all. You can have left or right-wing individualism or collectivism. And that, in fact, if you want to understand the strength of the Trump movement in the United States, I think you have to understand that Trump appealed to a right-wing collectivism at a time when the so-called left was not doing much of a job in appealing to collectivism at all. But what we're seeing in the case of the pandemic, which is fascinating, is people from various tribes looking at China or Vietnam or South Korea, or for that matter, to some extent, Germany, and seeing examples of effective social action that are lacking for them, that are, you know, while they set the world's records for numbers of cases and deaths, although now challenged by India, I'm sorry to say, the other nations have done a better job. And so if you ask, well, why have they done a better job at dealing with the virus? The answer seems to be, I mean, one, there was an initial impulse in the States to talk about authoritarianism, because there is a profound confusion in this culture, in our culture, between collectivism and authoritarianism, and partly as a legacy of the Cold War, as a legacy of having had Stalin as, you know, the villain. If you say collectivist, people say, "Oh, you're talking about authoritarianism." So if China, if they're going back to back to restaurants and back to business and so forth in China, that must be because they are so authoritarian and they just do what they're told. Well, China has there are authoritarian elements, to be sure, in that society, but there's also a sense of collective responsibility that's deeply ingrained in Chinese culture. That was part of the reason they had their revolution in the first place. So Americans, this is the first time I've ever seen, and I'm old, it's the first time I've ever seen Americans allowing themselves or being forced to admire the way other societies are solving a problem. Although they haven't come down to it, I don't think they've become quite conscious yet of the fact that you're talking about a combination of extremely activist government and collective solidarity. In the declining days of this empire, maybe we'll learn something about this. I don't know.
It will not decline because it's worse. Alternatives, not because I'm a very big fan, because alternatives are better. But I think it reminds me the Second World War, when the United States is entering the war. It was from the beginning. It takes time because it's democracy and it takes time. But I think maybe things will change in 1 and 2 years, because people are just waiting for the fast answer. They want to now and everything, and that's why the Chinese government or more authoritarian governments can provide these answers. But for the long period of time, but it's just a suggestion. It's kind of
interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, because it took time for the Second World War to the United States, after Pearl Harbor, to the United States open all the things, because societies have to decide in the democratic society. You cannot say just do it from now. So we see these things and the virus. But thank you very much, because I just don't want to put this further.
All right, thank you too.
Thank you, dear professor. If there is another a person who wants to ask a question, or if okay, thank you. So we